if people are leaving their kids' shit out at night, they just don't give a fuck, right? There's no pride of ownership. That'll tell another story about what's going on in the neighborhood. Something that I'd like to talk about or discuss, whatever, is the fact that you can talk yourself out of any deal ever. There's always negative aspects to every deal. There's always negative things that you're going to come across. There's always something that's...
No deal is ever perfect.
Exactly. No deal is ever perfect. So when John and I were down in Arizona, I was much closer to deciding that we're moving forward on that deal than John was earlier than John. Mm-hmm. It took John more to warm up because John looks at every single fucking angle that you possibly could. Mm-hmm. That's why I bring him though. Mm-hmm. So in the end, the only real angle that John had to like question the property was the validity of how high the rents were based off of other surrounding properties that offered more amenities. For example, like a pool or a barbecue area, which nobody ever fucking uses. But that's regardless, it's nice when you're walking through a property and it's got a pool. It looks cool. However, the advantages of our property, they're bigger units. The rent per square foot is absolutely in line. A lot of times what you would see, well, not a lot of times. In some cases, you might see like a 2-bed, 2-bath renting for not a whole lot more than what is being rented at Plate and Place. But the square footage is much bigger, and it's a boutique property, which is very advantageous when you think of it for multiple reasons. Number one, if you lived in a high rise. Mm-hmm. If you got groceries, you got to lug them through the foyer. You got to lug them up the stairs or the elevator, then into your unit. Whereas this particular property, you can park fairly close to your actual unit, your unit front door. So a lot of people like the boutique over the high rises and even mid rises. And also another advantage is they're much easier to secure. This is something that a lot of people don't actually realize. On high-rise properties or even, multiple, a couple hundred unit garden-style properties, a lot of times what you'll see is the front gate is like left open, or there'll be an area of fencing that's like in the back of the parking lot that somebody could simply like hop over, no problem. Whereas if you have a boutique style of apartment building, it's going to be a lot harder to take advantage of holes in security because there's simply less holes, right? And that was something that was some of the feedback that some of the tenants provided was some of the female tenants, the majority are female, but some of the female tenants provided is they feel extra secure in this particular property because it's actually difficult to get in. The other, like we toured a bunch of properties. About half of the properties, actually, I'm trying to think. I don't even think maybe one of the properties, the gate was closed, but all you have to do is press a button to open the gate. So you have a situation where, and then all the other ones, the gate to get into the parking lot and to get into like the actual complex, it was just open.
Right.
So how secure is that, right? And don't get me wrong, on high-rise buildings, you actually have to go into the front door, but typically those properties are not gated in the lot. The reason why you would gate a property is to prevent somebody coming in and having access to your front door. Whereas, now granted, this was during the day. They might simply keep it open during the day. We weren't there at night. Or didn't go to these properties at night. We toured our property at night, and I don't remember seeing anything that was closed. But that's the reason why you would have a gated surrounding area for the most part, because these garden-style units, that are 1, 2, or 3 stories high, there's no elevators. You could walk up to the front door. Whereas in Plate and Place, you can't get into the front door from the parking lot. You have a man gate that requires a code or a fob or whatever, whatever it is there. So you have a situation where it's ultra secure, and that's very important. And then another advantage to boutique style apartments is a lot of people love the idea of being familiarized with the majority of tenants in the property. They trust them. It's when you have 300 people in a property, or a tenant, 300 people as a tenant base, you don't know everybody. And, if you have a break-in, it could be one of the people that live there. So that's some of the feedback that we also got as well, is that people tend to like the boutique style apartments in the US, and, particularly this area. They would rather live there and not have a pool and trade it for a boutique style convenience. I don't know if that's the same in Canada or in the Toronto area. It seems like Toronto loves like the high rise and the views and that kind of shit. But I'm telling you, even to go to my buddies, what a pain in the ass. You're walking through, the door is secured, which is, not a big deal, but you're walking through, you're going through an elevator and you're walking down fucking 50 feet down a hallway. Like, it's just, whereas you could pull up right to your unit, walk through a gate, turn left, and you're there. So that's that.
Well, to kind of bring that full circle is that you were saying that people can talk themselves out of everything, and then when John went down there, he was being particular. Well,
I just went down a fucking rabbit hole there, eh?
It's okay. It was still interesting. Yeah. But you started with people will talk themselves out of everything, and that it took John a lot longer to be convinced on plate and place compared to you, just because he's a lot more particular and he looks at things from a lot of different angles, and that's when you got into what John actually liked. Was the overall security and
the tenants that like John was questioning the validity of the rent, saying that it appeared that rent was already top end and even questionable if it's sustainable. Right. Which we have a rent survey to prove it is not top end. It is not at the top, and it's in line with everyone else, if not below.
Right. So to kind of like now go back to people talking themselves out of everything and not having any deal that's perfect. Like, tell me some of the things that you do in order to kind of push forward and to continue to find deals and close on deals, and maybe even go into an example or two of a time that you did pull out of a deal that you actually might regret it.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I always try to look at to not allow fear to make decisions for me is to realize that, nothing's perfect. There's going to be issues with any kind of deal that I ever come across. And I typically look at real estate deals in a few ways, or there's a couple things that I confirm. Number one, is a submarket that I would want to be living in? Is the property a property that I would be comfortable living in? Would a single mom with her child be comfortable living in the property? Would a single mom with a child be comfortable living in that submarket or area? Does a cash flow? If so, is the cash flow producing at least over 5% annualized over 5 years, or as an average? And what kind of return am I going to be getting, overall on the property? Is it a return that, is my annualized return over, the average of 5 years going to, call it, say, be over 25%? If all of those check the boxes, it's going to be fairly difficult for me to turn away on a deal. I don't have a lot of requirements in order to check boxes for real estate. And then there's nuances when you go down there, right? I always have to see the property in person. I want to see the tenant base, and here's a couple things that I could tell people or give some people advice on that they may not notice or may not currently be looking for. Regardless if this is, apartment buildings at scale, a residential neighborhood that you're buying a single family home in, a duplex, fourplex, doesn't matter. So a couple of things that I look for are, number one, if I'm not local, if I'm local, I'll drive and take a look in person. If I'm not local, I'll go on Google Street View. What does the landscaping and grass look like in the neighborhood? Is it well cared for? Is it trimmed? Number two, what kind of cars are in the neighborhood and in the driveways or in the parking lots of places? That's number two. And number three, if I can't, again, if I'm not local, sometimes on Street View, you can kind of pick up on like in the area, like people will be walking along the street or whatever. What does the demographic in the area look like, right? And especially, I've mentioned this multiple times, but I'll actually park outside on, say, a Friday or Saturday night past midnight and see like who's walking around, what type of people are walking around. That'll tell a story of what's going on in the neighborhood. Is there trash laying around in the neighborhood? What do people's front yards look like? Are there cars parked on the fucking grass? Are there kids' toys like scattered all over the place? Right? Is there graffiti anywhere? Can you see any kind of graffiti like on the homes, on the sidewalk, or on the not common areas, but on like the public areas of that neighborhood? That will, if people are leaving their kids' shit out at night, they just don't give a fuck, right? There's no pride of ownership. That'll tell another story about what's going on in the neighborhood. Same thing with garbage. Is there garbage laying around? That was another thing that I noticed about this Clayton Place area. When I went there, it's a very clean area. Even in the depressed areas, it was still very clean. You didn't see like trash. You might not have had the most affluent, demographic in certain areas, in the Phoenix MSA. But what I did notice was you didn't really see garbage. It was actually a clean. Phoenix is a very clean MSA overall, which is something that I was pleasantly surprised with, to be honest.
Given how large the city is.
Yeah. You go to Toronto, there's fucking shit. I was just in Toronto this past week, and there's just garbage everywhere. It's gross.
Smells.
Exactly. Yeah. Like there's just like people just. I don't know what it is. I don't know why that would be, but those are a couple key points that I look for when I'm touring, submarkets and the localized, submarket cluster of that neighborhood that the property sits in. One property I could tell you that I do regret. There was a 32 unit or 33 unit apartment building right behind Hotel Dieu on Dougal, on Olette. And it was selling for like $100 a door. And this was not long ago. This was like 4 or 5 years ago. And I remember looking at that property with John, and we were like, fuck, that's expensive. And we really liked the property because it had its own parking lot. And I can't remember if there was underground parking or not. It was a mid-rise, so it was, had some height to it too. Balconies on all the floors. And it was like concrete construction. So it was very similar to Canton Manor. Very similar, but it was like white. And I remember looking at that thinking like, fuck, man, I should have bought that. And there's even a couple other buildings on Olette. I remember this one. I remember Maple Apartments on Olette. Connor, look up this building. Not the nicest apartments. Yeah, there was some density to it. I remember that thing hitting the market for $600,000. And I remember thinking, this was early on though. This was early on. This was probably like 2010, maybe even 9. And I remember thinking, fuck, man, I wish I had enough money to buy that thing. Because I remember I had some people that I knew some people that lived in there, and I had been in the property, and it was old and it was kind of run down, but it felt like still a good building. And it was, at that point in time, it was kept up. And I just didn't have the money. So I guess it's a little bit different than like regretting I passed up on it, not having the money. But those are a couple buildings as an example that, passing up on the opportunity where, could I have scrounged up the money to do it? Potentially. I do remember that the one behind Hotel Dieu, I probably could have done that deal. But at that point in time, it's almost like the market was really changing. So it was, hypothetically speaking, more expensive than where the market currently was for that property. But I knew in my mind that it was going to continue. And I knew that the building was solid. It was in a downtown core, even though Windsor's downtown isn't the greatest. It was, one of the things that I let myself being talked out of is that the new hospital is going to be taking over Hotel Dieu, and that the Hotel Dieu hospital is going to become obsolete. I have a couple opinions about that. Number one, the new hospital is going to take fucking forever to build, right? So there's that. I shouldn't have allowed that to make my decision for me, and I should have known that. But I also realize the fact that Canada's healthcare system is pretty strapped. That will always be some sort of healthcare property or building or whatever. Maybe it's long-term care. Maybe it's an ICU, or like maybe it's like hospice. It's set up still for healthcare. I bet you it still runs as healthcare. I would also venture a guess that with the aging population, that the new hospital being built off 42 is probably end up going to be getting strapped anyways shortly after it's built, regardless. Yeah. So, and then what are they going to do? They're going to leverage existing facilities more than likely, which is exactly what they did on Prince Road. So I let myself be talked out of that one, or get myself talked out of that one. The Maple Apartments, I remember looking at that one thinking like, man, that would be sick if I could buy that. I didn't have the money. That was really early on. But, and I remember seeing that property trade like literally only a few years later for like $2 million. Like I actually remember seeing that hit the market for like literally $2 million. I don't remember exactly how long ago, but it wasn't like a decade after. It was shortly after. Yeah. So there's a couple. So all in all, I think that I think people scrutinize properties way too much. I think if the property cash flows, if it's producing at least, at minimum, a 5% cash on cash return as an average over, call it 5 years, with a decent LTV on it, somewhere in between, even, as rates continue, like say 65 to 75% LTV. And if you're able to produce an annualized ROI of 25% expressed as an average over 5 years, I think you're doing really well. And if this property sits in a market or a submarket and submarket cluster where your tenant base feels safe, you would live there, and the analytical data supports or shows that the submarket and the market is growing. You don't want to necessarily buy in a declining market, right? But if the market's growing and there's solid, economic fundamentals in that market and submarket, it's a no-brainer. And if the quality of build is on par with at least the submarket, it's a buy.